Well, welcome to Christian Answers for this week. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible commentator and cultural commentator. So we try to have a Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other hand and try to make sense of the news from a Christian perspective. We want to use our presuppositions, our Bible truths, the wisdom that God has given us, and we need to go continually back to the Bible and find out what God is saying about truth and then apply that truth to the world. And so today we're going to again continue on thinking about this conflict in the Middle East between this terrific slaughter attack by the terrorist group Hamas coming from the Gaza Strip and Palestinians in the Gaza Strip toward Israel that resulted in the death of, I think it was 1,400 Israelis, and now there are still 200 and some captives, hostages taken back to Gaza Strip. It was a slaughter. It was a bloodbath. It was barbarism as we have not seen on a scale in a long, long time, sort of right out of the Holocaust scenarios that these Islamic terrorists just unprovoked came right on into Israel, went through entire towns, killing everyone in sight. This is the kind of barbarism that we haven't seen. I haven't seen in a long time, even since 9/11. This is kind of like Israel's 9/11, where you have people totally unsuspecting, and then people coming in to just totally kill and destroy. And so how do we think as Christians? How do we process this? We have to filter everything through the biblical Christian worldview because there's a lot of foolishness going on out there. You'll hear in the newspapers that, well, there's a conflict on both sides, and each side has its own reasons, and each side has its own points. Yes, there's a conflict between Arabs and Jews in the Middle East. That's a very general statement. But there is a difference between having an ongoing conflict and people from one side of that conflict coming in and just slaughtering the other side, families, children, women, raping women, beheading Israelis, civilians, non-combatants. This is a next level terrorism, and this kind of activity demands an action, a response. And so what should a Christian think about these things? Because who knows, this may come to the U.S. Next year, it may come next week or next decade. We don't know, but we have to know how to think about these kinds of things, or else we'll just be ignorant people lost in a sea of confusion and words and people saying one thing and the other thing, and on television and internet and radio, newspapers. There is a lot of confusion right now. And so let's try to clear up some of that confusion. The first, I want to go through a few points, 7 points. The first truth that as Christians we know is that the promised land, the land of Israel, it's Israel's land. Bottom line, it's their land. How do we know? Because the Bible says it. Again, we come back to the Bible. You're going to hear a lot of people saying, well, the ancient Jews stole it from the Canaanites. No, they didn't steal it from the Canaanites. God gave it to the Jews, not because they were good, not because they were great, just simply because out of God's sheer mercy gave it to the Jews, and that the Canaanite living in the land were so evil and so vile and so sinful. It says that the iniquity of the Canaanites had reached its full level. And so God says, I'm going to expel them from the land. And so he used Israel to come into the land, gave the Jews that land, expelled the wicked, evil Canaanites out of the land. And so that land was given to the Jews by God. No question. If we're biblical Christians, if we believe the Bible, if we have the Bible as our authority in life, then we have to recognize that that land is the Jews. So if you run into a Christian and they say, well, maybe it's really the Palestinians' land. No, it's the Jews. It's the Jews from that ancient time all the way to the present time. Now, there have been times when the Jews have not been in their land because they've been conquered by the Muslims had taken over that land and claimed somehow Muhammad this and Muhammad that, and according to their religion. But their religion's later. We have it in the Bible. It's documented thousands of years before Muhammad ever saw the light of day. The Jews were given the land by God. Case closed. So as Christians, we have to affirm that that land right there in the Middle East that's being fought for, that is Jewish land. And so as Christians, we need to stand by those Jews and say, this is your land. Now, we don't have to like everything the Jews do. In fact, the Jews are in rebellion against God as far as accepting Jesus. And so they're headed on the road to destruction for that. But they have been given that land, and that is their land, and they have a right to it. The second point is it's wrong for Hamas, or the Palestinian terrorists, to slaughter and kill Jews and to take hostages. That is wrong. It doesn't matter what side you're on. If you have to resort to that kind of activity, you don't deserve to have any kind of victory or land, or you don't deserve anything if you have to come in and take innocent civilians. And this is the hypocrisy of the news media right now. The Hamas Palestinian militants came in and slaughtered innocent babies and children and old women and raped women and killed entire families and went from house to house slaughtering and massacring, and then took hostages back into Gaza Strip. And now the news media is focusing on the fact that, there's so many people in Gaza that don't have water and electricity and all of that because Israel's trying to find out who these terrorists are and punish them and capture them. Totally overlooking the fact that there was a massacre that happened. Okay, there has to be some kind of response to that massacre. You can't massacre people like that. No civilized nation on this face of this earth deserves to be excused from that kind of behavior. If Israel had gone into Gaza or into Lebanon and carried out the atrocities that Hamas has done against Israel, then I would be against Israel. I wouldn't be saying that they don't have a right to the land. I'm saying that there is no excuse for that because that is barbaric. So as a Christian, one, it's Israel's land. Two, Hamas, the Palestinians who carried out this terrorist attack, totally barbaric act, are totally unjustified. Doesn't matter what your cause is. You cannot do that kind of barbaric slaughtering of innocent civilians and be justified. No cause is worth that. And these twisted, evil, sinful people who think that their cause overrides basic morality, they're wrong. They're wrong. As Christians, we need to say that. We say, no, it doesn't matter what your cause is. You can't go in and do that to children, beheaded children, and behead women and rape women and slaughter them in cold blood in front of their family. You cannot do that. That is violates the rules of civility. The third point, Israel has a right to self-defense and to counterattack. So they have every right to go into Gaza City and hunt down these terrorists. Now, some Christians on this point say, well, doesn't Jesus say, turn the other cheek? And yes, indeed, he does say, turn the other cheek. But you have to ask the question. And I pose this question to my Amish friends because the Amish always say, well, we need to be nonviolent, we need to be pacifists, we can never fight in a war. No nation should ever use a weapon to defend itself. There should be no weapons on the police. You can never, in self-defense, act to protect your family. This is all against God's command, turn the other cheek. Well, who is Jesus referring to? Is he talking about governments? Is he talking about nations? That would totally contradict everything in the Old Testament. That would totally contradict, for example, in the book of Romans, where Paul talks about that the government and the officers and the administrators in a government are responsible, are agents of God's wrath, dispensing justice and executing criminals because of God's desire that there be order in society. So you have in the New Testament a teaching that says that police and military are there for the stability and common good of everyone, and that they're God-ordained deacons. Actually, the word is deacon, or servants. They're the servants of God to bring about justice, and sometimes you have to use force to bring about justice. And the government's role, one of the primary roles of government, is to maintain order and to bring about justice, and that has to be done with the sword. It actually mentions that in the book of Romans. Paul talks about the government does not use the sword in vain. It uses it to administer justice, because the criminals, the bad guys, they don't always cooperate. Like if you knock on the door of a bad man and say, hey, we're going to bring you to prison, they will fight back. So what do? You just stand there and let them shoot at you? No, you go in with force to administer justice. This is what the New Testament teaches. This is consistent with the Old Testament. And it means that this naive, childish, immature idea that turn the other cheek means that governments can't use force is crazy. What Jesus evidently is talking about is on a personal level. We're not always going around demanding that every little ounce of justice be done in our own personal lives and get petty about it. You know, somebody says something offensive to you, so you have to combat that with an offensive remark to them, and tit for tat in your personal relationships, in your family relationships, in your marriage relationships, and so forth. And Jesus is saying, no, turn the other cheek. Learn to forgive them. Absorb that injustice. You don't have to have every injustice done to you. You don't have to give it back or get your revenge, or you can learn to turn the other cheek. That's Christ's commands. Learn to love and absorb and forgive. But you can't do that on a government level. You can't have someone like Israel sitting there in the Middle East and having this barbaric terrorist group, thousands of terrorists come into your nation, slaughter your people, and just say, well, we can't retaliate, we can't hunt them down, and we can't punish them, and we can't exact revenge because, Jesus said, turn the other cheek. No, that would be a total misreading of Scripture. You have to learn how to handle the Word of God and handle it accurately. He is not speaking of nations. He's not speaking of governments. He's not speaking of military. He's speaking of personal relationships. He's speaking of personal interactions. And we need to keep the difference in mind, or else we're going to fall into this trap of thinking, well, Israel shouldn't go in to Gaza City and hunt these people down. No, they should. And they need to make sure that they hunt them down and they go in, and that's the fourth point. Israel must today destroy Hamas, and if necessary, Hezbollah in the north, to prevent these future evils from happening. So they not only have the right to self-defense and the right to retaliate because they're a government, they must go in and show force and capture these bad guys. And they are evil, wicked bad guys that did this, that slaughtered people in their homes, in their living rooms, in their bedrooms, in the early mornings. They attacked this music concert. Now, what was taking place at the music concert? Well, do I like the kind of music that was played? Do I have to like the atmosphere? Let's say it's Woodstock, and a lot of drugs were being taken and a lot of immoral sexual activity was being taken. And let's say the rock music was of the worst kind possible. And it was even evil satanic music at this Woodstock like situation. It still wouldn't be right for the terrorists to come in there and say, well, we don't like what's going on. We're going to slaughter these people that are at this concert. And that's what they did in Israel. They came into this concert, this dance concert, this contemporary, I think it's electronic music, and this festival, and they just started shooting people indiscriminately. People were trying to get out of the rock concert, and they would shoot in the front window of the car that was traveling and kill the people inside and come up next to them and finish them off. It was a slaughter. And so this kind of activity must not ever take place. This group must not ever be able to do that again. They cannot coexist in this world. We cannot have groups like this. This is why, for example, in the Wild Wild West, you had these outlaw gangs who would stop a stagecoach and they would kill everyone inside and take all the money. Well, you think the town people are just supposed to let that happen and say, well, that was really misfortunate? No. They would get the sheriff and they'd get a posse together and they'd hunt these evil, wicked robbers and murderers down and put them on trial. And usually in the Old West, they'd hang them. And that's what they need to do with these Hamas terrorists. Capital punishment. They need to catch every single one of these Palestinian and other non-Palestinian terrorists, Hamas, the leadership and everyone who was connected with this, and publicly execute them. Yes, just like the Old Testament says. And as a public display of, look, you do this savagery, barbaric activity, this is what's going to take place. Now, the next point. Civilians, unfortunately, will be killed or injured in this war. So Israel is going to try to hunt down these evil terrorists, these Hamas, insane, evil, wicked people, in an effort to stop them from ever doing this again, because we need to rid the world of this kind of activity. You cannot have people like this running around in a civilized world who at any moment might come into your town or village and go house to house and murder everyone in the homes. You cannot have that. The whole world has to unite on that. You cannot have that kind of activity to have an orderly world. And this falls under the government of Romans that Paul talks about, where it does not bear the sword in vain. The government has to rise up when something like this happens, and it has to take decisive action. And so Israel has the right to go into this Gaza city and hunt down the terrorists. Now, in the process of doing that, there are going to be civilians killed, but Israel has to be very careful that they don't indiscriminately fire into Gaza with rockets and bombs and bullets that will indiscriminately hit civilians. Now, Israel already knows this, and they are very careful. In fact, before they blow up a building that they think the terrorists are in, they let everyone know in the building that it's going to be blown up and get out of there. They warn them. You know, what other army warns the enemy that they're going to hit? So, yeah, this really hurts Israel's efforts to catch these bad guys because, well, Hamas can get out of there too. So you're telling the enemy who is cowardly hiding beneath the civilian population in the basement. And that's what Hamas does. They always hide in the midst of the civilians, so that if you're going to kill Hamas, you're going to have to kill civilians to do it. They know that, and they're so cowardly that they're willing to even hide behind the civilians to survive. This is totally barbaric and shows how cowardly they are. They cannot even stand on their own 2 feet. They have to hide behind a baby or a woman or a hospital. There was recently a report, a lie, a falsehood, a propaganda put out by Hamas and the Palestinian authorities that Israel had struck a hospital and killed 500 people. That was a complete lie. Israel had not struck a hospital, and they had not killed 500 people. But it went all around the world, and it enraged all kinds of Muslims to take up arms, and it just confused and infused a lot of violence in the world. Come to find out, it was the terrorists' own bomb weapon that fell in a parking lot, not the hospital, fell in a parking lot next to the hospital and killed these civilians. It was the terrorists who did it themselves, but they're going to turn it around and try to blame Israel. Again, this is going to take place in a war. And if you look back in the Old Testament, when Israel had to fight wars, there was casualties of wars. There were innocent people that died. This always happens in wars. If you're not going to have a war, then no casualties of war will result. But if you're going to allow for war, and that's what God does, he allows for war, for self-defense of a nation, then you're going to have casualties. And unfortunately, we need to pray that the casualties are kept to a minimum, that these cowardly Hamas fighters will not hide behind children and women and civilians, and that they'll get out there in the open. And if they're going to fight, let them fight, but not behind these innocent people. So we already know that Israel is trying to not target civilians. They're trying to target the Hamas people. But unfortunately, we know that there will be some casualties. And it always depends on how many civilians that Hamas hides behind. So if they're going to continue to hide behind civilians, there are going to be more and more civilians killed. So it's not Israel's fault. They're going to stop this evil, savage, barbaric group. And they're going to do it. And there will be casualties involved, unfortunately. And again, we need to pray that there are minimum casualties. But we can't stop the response. You can't. And that's the problem here. We have a lot of people trying to micromanage this war. And even the United States and our government under Joe Biden, he's going to try to delay the ground invasion, and he's going to try to manipulate things, and he's just playing into the hands of the terrorists. So as Christians, we need to really be careful. Don't believe the lies, the propaganda that you're getting from the left and the news media, and this idea of some moral equivalent. Well, now Israel is acting terrible in trying to go into Gaza. No, they're trying to stop an existential threat to their whole country. Because if you don't go after these terrorists, they're going to regroup. They're going to do this again and again and again. And you're not defending your people. You're not defending Israel over there. And we need to defend Israel. We need to make sure that we do not in any way encourage this kind of terrorism to take place anywhere in the world. And we need to show the world, we need to tell people, you cannot get away with this kind of savagery. Now, if you have a dispute, if you have an argument, you need to try to negotiate. You need to use diplomacy. You need to try to argue your case before the world. And if you keep at it, you might find a solution and you might be able to settle. But this Palestinian conflict has been going on now for 50 some years, over 50, 60 years. And there doesn't seem to be any willingness on the part of Palestinians and these terrorist groups to even try to negotiate. What their goal is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, period. That's their goal. That's the only outcome that they will accept. And so, how do you negotiate with someone whose only goal is your destruction? Who do you negotiate with? You negotiate with the people that came into Israel and slaughtered all these innocent civilians? Is that who you negotiate with? Do you negotiate with some larger terrorist group? How can you believe them? If they're willing to kill innocent babies and children and women to get their cause, how can you accept anything they say or believe and trust in any way? No. The only way this can be dealt with, unfortunately, is that Israel has to go in and destroy every last Hamas fighter and leader, and totally destroyed, and say to any other terrorist group, if you want to do this kind of activity, slaughtering innocent civilians, if you want to wipe us off the face of the earth, you will never, ever be free, because we will hunt you down and we will kill you, and justly so. And this is justice, and this is appropriate. Nations have a right and a responsibility to protect the citizens within their borders. God has established governments, and he's established principles that demand justice within the country and outside of the country. If another country wants to come in and slaughter your citizens, you have a right to defend yourself. And if these terrorist groups keep on attacking the Jews in Israel on their land, we've already established that. The Bible talks about that's the Jewish land. God gave it to them. The Bible is the authority for life. And if we're going to set aside the fact that God gave the land to the Jews and start talking about, well, the Palestinians, they have an argument. No, that's Jewish land. And the Jews are willing to settle and live freely with the Palestinians, but the Palestinian terrorist groups will not allow that. They cannot accept the Jews on the land. They will not settle in a land with Jews. They have within them this nature that says, no, there cannot be Jews on this land, and we will never stop fighting until the Jews are gone. Well, if you have someone like that, the only solution is those people have to be gone, because they are unwilling to make peace. They are unwilling to settle for peace. And the Jewish people in this respect are totally right. And they're totally justified in going into Gaza City, totally justified in seeking out and eradicating these members of Hamas. And would that those fellow Arab nations like Egypt take in the refugees, but they don't want them either, because they know that the terrorists are in their midst. And they know that the Palestinian people are very sympathetic to Hamas. So you have a group of people who are in trouble in many, many ways, but that's trouble oftentimes they've caused for themselves. So as Christians, we need to be very clear. We need to center our thinking on the Bible and not be swayed by all these opinions in the news media and all these reports and this propaganda coming from Hamas and the terrorist groups. We need to stand on the truth. We'll see you back next week. God bless.